different topics. It is really being initiated today while policy advocacy continues to be the core at FICCI. We have been engaging actively on key economic issues and policy issues covering over 70 sectors. The expert view will be our endeavor to get the insights from the latest economy and policy developments from the very best in the area for you. Today, we are really privileged to have with us Dr. Satyanarayana Shukla, Chief Economist, Mahindra Group with us. He also chairs the FICCI Economists Forum. He is a renowned expert and widely acknowledged in the area of understanding the economic and financial issues, and has over 2 decades of experience in the sector. He is actually going to be presenting insights on the economic outlook for the year 2021-22. We are nearing the end of September, so it is really, looking at the past 6 months and the next 6 months going forward if we look at the fiscal year. Although we have had significant learnings in dealing with the pandemic situation over the past year and a half, and the momentum in the vaccination drive is providing some cushion, there seems to be different types of perspectives on the economic review going forward. Our latest survey on the economy indicates that weak demand continues to be a constraining factor for majority of participants. On the other hand, a manufacturing survey showed uptick in capacity utilization, but then again, it was constrained by high input prices and a bit of demand constraints. But I'm not the expert. We are not the expert. The real expert is Dr. Shukla with us today. I would like to first thank him for accepting our invitation, and also like to invite Dr. Shukla to share his prognosis on the economy and the possible risks for global and domestic. Also, we would like to hear his views and his insights on what could be a strategy for speeding up recovery going ahead. So thank you all the participants for attending, and I want to thank Jyoti and Anshuman and the team for putting this together. And over to you, Dr. Shukla.
Thank you, Mr. Churai. Thank you for that warm welcome and a great initiative, Team FICCI. I hope the audience and the members really enjoy it as it evolves over time. What I'm going to do over the next, say, 25 odd minutes is walk you through some slides and just give you some perspective as to how to decode, how to actually see the evolving data. As you know, things are changing extremely rapidly, and we have seen just sheer extremes when it comes to real economy data, financial economy data, and therefore the attempt here is going to be how to look and interpret this data in this rapidly evolving scenario. So please bear with me as I put up some slides for you. Is this visible?
It's visible.
Yes, it is. Please go ahead.
Right. Thank you so much. So I think this is something that I thought really captures what we are facing right now, this picture. So we are all in the same storm, but different boats really. And over the course of next 20 to 25 minutes, we will see how this is really impacting each entity, whether it is an individual, whether it is an economy, even within economies, how it is really impacting different states differently, different businesses within the same sector differently. So here we go. I think the very first thing that I wanted to point out was just fasten your seatbelts for the growth yo-yo. We've just seen a record number for Q1. We haven't really experienced an 18-19% kind of a growth, YY growth, right? We haven't ever seen that. Now, the thing is, there are multiple ways of interpreting. So let me just walk you through some data within this growth rate. So let's look at the real GDP. You can see actually a V-shaped recovery. On the left-hand side, this is quarterly growth rate, the top left. If you look at the agriculture, this has probably been a saving grace. This has been the employer of the last resort in the Indian economy. And as you see, there is a seasonal variation in the growth rate in agriculture. Just let me use the pointer. If you look at industry again, let me say this has also been a saving grace. This has bounced back much faster, and industry and within industry, manufacturing has been really doing well. And you can see that we are back to pre-pandemic levels over here. But when it comes to services, the bottom right chart, services actually we are still some way off where we were, and this is a large sector which has implications for employment as well. As you know, our economy is largely informal, and a lot of jobs also come from this particular segment. And there are several sub-segments within services, contact services, for example, which remain impacted negatively even as we speak. Now, let's look at the same numbers in a slightly different framework. We all have read in our school or college days the Keynesian framework, C plus I plus G, X minus I, which is the import part. So let's look at consumption first. Consumption has actually come back to where we were just about, I mean, it's slightly under that. But this is an area of concern. This is something that we pride ourselves on, that Indian economy is a consumption-based economy. And this is where some of the concerns are, which is where I think policy has still some role to play going forward. If you look at investment demand, this is something that we can take some heart from. This has really gone up, and this is in rupee terms, real terms. If you look at what has been supporting a lot of this activity is this government consumption bit, you can actually see massive peaks from government. I mean, largely there is a variation, I mean, some sort of a seasonal kind of flow and ebb. But this has really been a big supporting factor so far in terms of the recovery. And thankfully, this is a piece that has been doing well. Now you can see the end point here, the bottom chart. As we speak, this number, this worm has actually crept up much higher, and exports have been really helping sustain some of the momentum. When I look at some of the mobility data, again, the same V-shaped recovery, you can actually see that after the second wave hit, all of this collapsed in a heap, and then it has bounced back much faster than a lot of people would have anticipated. And more or less, we are back to where we were in terms of the activity. Although if I compare it to, say, pre-pandemic levels, it is probably slightly under that, but assuming there is no other wave, we will probably sail through this. This brings us to vaccines and vaccination. Now, just look at this chart. There is a big dichotomy between the developed and the developing, and you can see the top half of the chart basically saying that more than 46% of the population in higher income economies has been fully vaccinated. Whereas when you look at the bottom of this chart, it's less than 10%. And even within this segment, if you look at the poorest ones, less than 2% people have been vaccinated, which is a travesty in terms of how this vaccine inequity is impacting economies. Now, it has a direct bearing on the growth rate. So just look at what I'm trying to say. This is the growth rates of select economies like the US, Eurozone, Japan, etc. And if you look at 2020 versus 2021, just look at this number, 7% growth. And no, this is not some emerging economy. This is the United States of America. When have we all seen a large economy like the US growing at 7%? So I think this basically tells us that any strategy, any growth strategy which is based on vaccination has really worked better than lockdown-based strategy in terms of growth. And this is exactly what you see in terms of calendar 20 and 21 averages also. So one might say that let's not look at individual years, 2020 and 21, because there is this V-shaped recovery that has happened. 20 was impacted by the pandemic. But even from a 2-year average growth rate, it's very clear that vaccine-based strategy, look at this number in the US, and then look at China. They've clearly surpassed any other comparable economy of their size. Some good news in terms of vaccinations in India. 63% of all adults have received one dose, and at least 20% are fully vaccinated. Now, this data is as of 13th September. And this really bodes well for the growth sustenance in the economy, especially when you tie it up with the second seroprevalence survey, which basically said that 68% of the population has some sort of antibodies. And therefore, this 68% seroprevalence plus 20% fully vaccinated population, which will continue to move up. And you can see how this has really picked up post-June dramatically. And this really bodes well going forward. Let's now look at the composition, some of the balance sheets in the economy, which really matter. We spoke about the Keynesian framework. Let's look at the corporate sector first. Corporate balance sheets have really improved. Debt to equity ratios across, say, manufacturing, if you look at non-financial services, have improved. And then if you look at any sub-segment within the corporate segment, all of them have been able to deleverage. Basically meaning they are in a better position to now really spend going forward. If you look at bank balance sheets, which do the lending in the economy, which are vital, you can see that the gross NPA pressure, I mean, we had this number at 11% peak here, went down all the way to 7.5%, even with the COVID backdrop. Now, in the worst case scenario, it will go up because of the second wave and the impact of COVID. But again, this is not something which is really going to bother a lot of the private sector banks, and also some of the larger public sector banks, which can really lend onwards. So I think with this combination, we can see some sustainability. We can estimate some sustainability in the growth rate going forward. Another important thing is if you look at the real private gross capital formation growth rate, it has always sort of tied in with private sector capex. So just look at the profitability growth. If that really sustains, and which is why I mentioned the balance sheets in the previous slide, if profitability comes back to the corporate sector, you will see this GCF really going up. So just look at the previous cycle, 2002 to 5-6. It just zoomed, and you can see that it went in sync with the private sector profit growth. So PAT level went up dramatically, and so did the capex, I mean, if you were to call it that. Another important balance sheet in the economy is the household balance sheets, right? That is something that has really taken a hit. We know 2 consecutive years of COVID has impacted incomes. So this is the second year in a row where the household balance sheets have been impacted in terms of incomes, and the household liabilities have gone up, and household debt has moved up to about 38%, you can see here. And the other thing, which is very important from the consumption perspective, is that the per capita income growth, I think that is in a spot of bother. It's actually come down, and the government will have to really look at that metric if we want the growth story, especially on the consumption, to sustain going forward. What can really help this story go forward? It is fiscal and monetary, a very difficult task. But you can actually see that even though the fiscal deficit is budgeted to come off, but it will still remain at fairly elevated levels. We are talking about the central government spending, if you look at that, or the fiscal deficit. In whatever metric you use, the point I'm making is these are still fairly elevated, and these are going to be supportive of the recovery in the economy. Now, this is just in a lighter vein. I mean, You know the NPA story, you know what has happened with ILFS and some of the issues that the banking system has seen. You have seen the FM yesterday speak about the bad bank taking off. So it is in that context a light-hearted take. But I think on a serious note, credit growth is going to be the key in terms of any real sustenance when it comes to the growth rate. Just look at this. There is a correlation between the nominal GDP growth rate, which is the amber sort of line here, and credit growth. So it moves in sync with the credit growth number, and just see how it has fallen. So credit growth after this peak of 30 plus in 2008, post Lehman, it has started to come off, and from the 30 plus, we've gone down all the way to single digits. And this is something that really needs to move up, which is why the announcements made by the Honorable Finance Minister do make a lot of sense for supporting this. Another important metric that you will continue to get, see this in the media and in economic discourse, is labor markets and job creation. This has definitely been impacted. Unfortunately, in India, we don't really capture this data very well, like some of the other developed economies, and there are multiple data points and multiple interpretations. But having said that, I think I made that point earlier that services economy or the services segment still a bit off from the pre-pandemic levels, and that is a large employer. Some of these subsectors in the services piece are actually big employers. We know of the trade, hotels, restaurants piece, or some of the other segments, contact services, which employ a lot of people. So that will remain a drag on the economy. This is something that the government really will have to address. And an important point that I wanted to highlight here is what I've done here is broken the IIP into labor-intensive and capital-intensive segments. Just look at how badly impacted the labor-intensive segments have been. So there is typically an average gap of 15 to 20%. This is more than doubled during the pandemic. So we are clearly seeing an impact on labor and employment, and this is something that needs to be addressed. How do we do that, or how is the government really trying to address this? Is this Make in India piece? We have seen a lot of action. Recently, the government came up with the PLI for automobiles, especially focused on the EV side, trying to make the auto sector future ready. And some of these initiatives, along with the export momentum, the pickup, you can see the huge pickup that has happened because, like I mentioned, some of the developed economies which are really basing their growth strategy on vaccinations are really seeing a lot of demand. Export numbers are a testimony. So if you look at some of the things that the government has been trying to do, a whole host of these reforms, we know that the government has announced reforms on the labor side. They have tried to spruce up the supply side. They're trying to do an infra-based, we've seen the budget really talk about it with a strategy. They're also trying to monetize assets. So if you put all of these things together, along with the cost of doing business, if it is addressed, just like the government tried to address the ease of doing business over the last few years, I think this should, in some way, alleviate the pressure on employment, although that remains the biggest question, not just for government of India, but governments everywhere in the world. How do we revive the labor market? How do we provide employment to people, especially having the size and the demographics like India? Another important thing as we go forward is every single day you look at the markets making new highs, and that is where the role of policy excesses or easy liquidity or too much liquidity, you will see a lot of people really criticizing this. And just look at the gargantuan size of this liquidity, what we're talking about. This 2020, central banks pumped in about 8 trillion. Another 8 odd trillion these fiscal authorities have pumped in. So just look at these numbers. Looks crazy. and this is a lot of money, 15, $16 trillion put together, is a lot of money, and that is chasing very few assets. And what it does is makes the price of these assets being chased higher. Just look at how it is impacting India. FIIs have pumped in about $7.5 billion in India, if you look at it from a calendar year to date. And compare it to some of the competing economies or peer set, as we call it. Look at Indonesia, they've got just about $1.5 billion. Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, all of these have actually seen negative inflows, right? So just now, 7.5 doesn't really look like a large number, but when you compare it with the kind of outflows you've seen in Taiwan, 15 billion, you've seen Korea having 25 odd billion outflow, that 7.5 then looks largish, right? Also look at what it's doing. So this is the equity piece. Look at what it's doing to the commodity side. Look at any hard commodity. Look at aluminium, look at copper, look at zinc, anything, and it's really gone up. Look at coal, look at crude oil, right? Natural gas. All of these have really zoomed because of easy liquidity. And to top it all, we have seen a huge capital raising by startups in India and private companies, and $10 billion were raised in just July alone. Experts estimate that we could see about $35–40 billion coming into the Indian private company universe via this global capital flow. And if I want to put it in perspective, this number when total is going to be much more than what the government is offering on PLI and then spread over 5 years. So this is the kind of liquidity, this is the kind of excess that some people are talking about. And what do they mean by unwinding? What is it that they're trying to imply? Just look at what happened in 2013 when the taper tantrum happened. Just look at the rupee, how it lost value quickly. I mean, it depreciated by 20%. This ideally should be seen as an inverted chart. But just look at the way it zoomed in a very, very short span of time. April to August, it was down 20%. So a lot of people do fear some sort of an impact on the currency and interest rates if there was some unwinding of this liquidity, especially by the larger central banks such as the Fed. But there is a positive. I mean, this whole talk globally on sustainable growth and sustainability. We have seen rains, very, very sporadic, excess rains in short spans of time. We have seen that in Delhi, we've seen that in several state capitals. We saw that yesterday in Lucknow and some of the northern states. And if you look at it globally, I mean, there are multiple examples of these excesses. And therefore, it is high time that the world comes together on sustainable growth. And I think this is an area where a lot of work is happening. ESG suddenly become the most important factor in corporate boardrooms and in, say, government negotiations. And therefore, I think this is something that bodes really well for all of us going forward. The last bit that I want to highlight is I started with that same storm, different boats. How are we all in different boats? I just wanted to show you how it is impacting everybody differently. I think I've got just 5 minutes. I will run you quickly through this. So if you look at FY21 and FY22 growth rates, FY22, this growth number is close to say 9.5. Everybody is 9.5%, or some people are around 10. Even if you look at 9.5, which the RBI talks about, this is an average number and hides a lot of things that are happening below the GDP line, right? Just yesterday, you saw Ola selling 600 crore worth of e-scooters in one single day, right? There are these new cars with wait list of 8 to 10 months, and that should not really take our eyes off the fact that if we were to look at it from a longer term perspective, car sales are still where they were in September 13. Two-wheeler sales, irrespective of what Ola did in just the 600 crore. Just look at where we are in terms of industry sales numbers. We are talking about May 10 kind of numbers. Look at CVs. it is back to September 09 kind of numbers. And auto, I mean, the three-wheeler piece is actually falling off the chart literally, because in the last 20 years, we have not really seen these kind of numbers, such bad numbers. So I think we need to keep see these numbers in perspective, and it's very, very differential. I made a point about manufacturing and services. There is a divergence. An important divergence that I wanted to highlight, which will continue to manifest going forward. Consumer sentiments, this is the normal line, 100. See how deep down negative it is. I mean, from 100, it is close to 50 currently as we speak. But at the same time, business sentiments are positive. They bounced back, right? You can see them really zooming. And the reason is not very difficult. I spoke about how incomes have been impacted, and therefore, and also it has taken a toll on lives. And therefore, consumers are circumspect, whereas business sentiments are positive because they're looking ahead, and they have actually seen balance sheet improvements and also profitability really come back, and therefore they are optimistic. And this is going to be the seesaw in terms of how the festive season really goes. Again, a very important distinction I wanted to make. Just look at rural sentiments. It's bounced back much faster. All of us thought with the kind of impact it had, the second wave had on the lives, the rural part has bounced back much faster than the urban, although it still remains deep negative, but it is an important distinction to note that rural sentiments are more buoyant than the urban, which is slightly counterintuitive. Another way of looking at things is if you look at rural deposit growth, it's coming down from March 20. So when COVID hit last year, since then, deposits are coming down. What does this mean? It means that people are drawing down their savings in the rural parts of the country, whereas in urban part, people have been benefiting from some forced savings because you're locked in your homes because of lockdown and you're not able to spend as much. And therefore, the savings have gone up. So this is again a dichotomy that we all need to understand. It will have implications for products and consumption and strategies going forward. Another important implication, just stretching the argument, just look at AUMs of portfolio managers and mutual fund AUMs of HNIs. This wealth has gone up by 5 trillion in just one single year, in which a lot of this drawdown happening on the rural side. At the same time, a small set of people, I mean, this is about 1.5, 2 lakh in numbers in terms of people. And you have seen their wealth zoom by about 5 trillion. If I talk about 2 years, 7.5 trillion rupees worth of gains made in just about 2 years. So what am I saying? Just trying to summarize, looking at the watch. The good part is the growth seems to be back in most of the segments, barring the ones that we spoke about, services and contact services. And vaccination has really picked up. And we have seen evidence globally that if it is a vaccination-based strategy, there are chances of the growth really sustaining, the speed really, momentum being maintained. Another important thing, there is some fiscal space with the government, which hopefully gets utilized in a targeted fashion, and that will support consumption because it really requires support. And monetary policy remains supportive. We've seen the statements from the RBI governor, deputy governor, and their releases throughout, and they continue to back growth. And I think an important element, distinction I made, corporate and bank balance sheets are in a much better shape. They can really help the recovery take shape by investing, and the capex cycle can come through, provided the government really sustains the momentum on infra-based. The not so bad, Make in India story pick up. I mean, the PLI schemes are getting announced. We've seen the auto piece getting announced. A lot of these will pick up over time. I mean, they will take time in manifesting in terms of real output, in terms of employment, and that is the not so bad piece. We do hope that this story really picks up momentum. And I mentioned multi-speed recovery. There are pockets in the economy. You'll continue to see news snippets which point out to hyper sort of growth in certain segments. But at the same time, let's not lose sight of the bottom of the pyramid. There is still a differential recovery happening. There is a very, very different speed that is really, I mean, the growth story is playing on in different speeds. Greener growth, again, we are still negotiating, governments, corporates, everybody trying to put their, strategic thoughts and pieces, blocks for the future now. And hopefully, this will turn out to be a much better, sustainable long-term story for us. So what is the bad part? I think credit recovery, you've seen credit growth remain just around 6%. I showed you how high it was, 32, 33%. And it's collapsed from there in a heap. And this is really important. And if this doesn't really pick up, we will have a constraint in terms of availability of liquidity, irrespective of what the RBI does. I think the bank-led credit growth needs to come back. And that is a bit of a struggle right now. Labor markets and job creation is going to be the question number one for every politician in the world, every government in the world. And I think this is a story that will remain stressed in the medium term. And hopefully some of these things that we spoke about pick up momentum and are able to support the labor markets. The last bit, I think the asset price inflation and unwinding of policy excesses, I think this is like hanging fire. This is a concern that most people continue to have. As we go forward, as markets continue to make new highs, commodity prices keep moving up, I think you'll start to see a lot of, say, worries and corporates as well as governments will have to take note of this and try to dealing from some of these excesses. So I will stop here. I think exactly on time. Anshuman, back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Shukla. It's always been a pleasure to listen to you, and this time was no different. Thank you so much for such a detailed presentation and for sharing, insights on some very, very interesting, trends which we all will continue to follow in the weeks and months ahead. I'm sure our members who watched this particular episode, would have several takeaways. We of course look forward to welcoming you back with us in some of our future sessions. And as I said, it's always a pleasure to listen to you. So thank you once again on behalf of the entire team at FICCI for joining us today. And ladies and gentlemen, with that, we come to the close of this session and look forward to having you with us next week. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shukla.
Thank you.
Thank you.